Ok, pues estamos listos para iniciar. Tenemos ya casi 100 personas conectadas.
We are ready to begin. We have almost 100 people connected. So before anything, welcome everybody to this session on the implementation of good regulatory practices, regulatory impact and effectiveness. And well, I have nothing else to say but a couple of recommendations and to recommend
Tienen sus micrófonos.
all the participants that you all have your microphones closed so that we can guarantee the quality of the recording of this event. As we mentioned, we're going to publish here in the coalition website so that it can be available for anybody who would like to enter, as well as all the presentations. We would thank you if you include all of your questions in the Q&A session in the website. In the platform, we rather use this option and not the chat to make sure that we have a visibility of all the questions and we are answering all of them. If we cannot answer them during the event, then we will be sharing the answers, the questions after this session. For all presenters, we would ask you to keep your camera open whenever you're doing your presentation so that we can facilitate the work of the interpreters. And we would like to remind everybody we have interpretation, English and Spanish. If you wish to have access to the introductions, then you can do this by using the channels that are uploaded in the lower part of the platform. And so without further ado, I will pass the floor to Besa Boniti, who is going to help us moderating this event. Besa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Sandra. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar. I have to say this is the second webinar of the series for good regulatory practices. And today we will focus on the implementation of GRPs and regulatory impact and effectiveness. First, I would like to present Michelle Rodriguez, who will be giving welcoming remarks to this webinar. She is the FDA Director with the America office, where she serves and oversees all FDA activities in the region, including food and medical products. And before moving in this role, she served as a regional deputy director for the FDA Latin America office. And she's been with the agency for over 12 years now and has held various leadership and supervisory roles within the agency. Welcome, Michelle, and feel free to take over.
Thank you so much, Besa and Sandra. I personally would like to take this opportunity to really thank you again. Like Besa mentioned, this is our second one of this type of webinars. We had the first one last July, which was a complete success. So that kind of like got us excited to put together this second one, and definitely helped to initiate conversations, right, and dialogues in the region. And we're truly convinced that the opportunities from learning from each other in these events are a valuable tool to improve our systems and align with international best practices. I would say that good regulatory practices should be fundamental to our agencies, and as it allows for more efficient and transparent decision making. And we can certainly do that by having, conversations with our stakeholders, through the use of international standards, and also by developing regulations that are flexible enough to accommodate the ever-changing landscape of medical products. I would also add that the aligned implementation of GRPs in the region would certainly add to those benefits by promoting and enabling reliance, which is something that we're all interested on, and recognizing mechanisms. And this is why our agency considers this to be a relevant topic for our outreach activities. So again, we are looking forward to have more of these and to continue conversations with you, all of you, and learn from the different perspectives. So I'm sure this would not be just a second one. It would probably be one of many. So if there are any recommendations, suggestions for improvement of this one, or if you have any other topic for outreach activities that you would like us to consider, please let us know, and we will be happy to have those conversations. So I won't take much time. I just want to wish everybody luck with the presentations and to enjoy the webinar today, and encourage everyone to have a good conversation and ask lots of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for those welcoming remarks. It is my pleasure. I think we can get right into the agenda. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Sandra Gia. She previously just said some remarks before, but in this session, Sandra will be discussing MDRC update on GRP-related activities in the Latin America region. Sandra currently is serving as Executive Secretary for Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the medical technology sector, which unifies its 18 largest industry bodies in the Western Hemisphere. And she also leads the Tier 2 component of the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence COVID-19 project under the USAID and ANSI Standards Alliance Initiative, which encompasses work with various countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Sandra, welcome, and feel free to take over and share your screen.
Thank you very much, Besa. And I will continue in Spanish, if I may.
That would be great.
¿Sí ven mi pantalla?
Sí.
Me parece que, ¿verdad? Excelente. Pues muchísimas gracias, muchas gracias.
So thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank the FDA for the space that they provided for the second round on good regulatory practices. And as Michelle was saying, this is just the beginning, even though it's a second session and we've had several sessions as a coalition, and as FIFARMA has also done so regarding this topic, we know that this is still a new topic for most of us. And the intention of these events is to learn, to share the actions that we're carrying out. How can we continue learning and getting new ways to get this knowledge to everybody and to be able to use it to benefit patients in the whole region by just having regulations that are as effective and as sufficient as possible. So I'm going to share what we've been doing as a coalition, as part of the Regulatory Convergence Project. As Vesa was saying, the coalition has 18 entities that group the main stakeholders in the medical devices sector in the American continent. We've worked very closely with different members, regulatory members, like the INI-CSI and MIRA, and we also collaborate very closely with ISO, IEC, and ASTM. This is important because when we talk about good regulatory practices, the use of international standards as the basis to develop regulations is really necessary. Now, I want to briefly share, and I'm not going to read all of this, what is the vision of the coalition. Their main intention is to have a standard, a test that is accepted everywhere in all jurisdictions so that medical technology can be assessed following the same scheme globally. That would be the ideal. And as part of the mission of the coalition, well, the intention is also to work in order to achieve regulation standards and requirements to assess conformity of medical technology, which are internationally aligned. The coalition has a main commitment regarding how to support the countries in the region for institutionalizing good regulatory practices, working and operating under quality management systems. If we all do so, it becomes one of the main topics and a natural topic, because that way we can institutionalize good regulatory practices. We know that in the Americas, we are in process of achieving this institutionalization in a general overview. And to that regards, the intention is for good regulatory practices to be working following normalized operation regulatory aspects that include international standards. There is a full and development of regulatory impact analysis to do public consultations and do international notifications whenever necessary for each one of the cases also. And all of this would help us and be the basis so that we could have a much more effective implementation of the reliance and the acknowledge that will lead us then to have this, take this from the theory to practice, for them to become elements that allow us every day to have processes that are much more effective and efficient. And these effective and efficient processes will then be created when we have regulatory frameworks that comply with those same characteristics. I know that this session is focused on the Americas, but as Vesa was saying, in the regulatory convergence framework for medical devices, we've been working with countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And throughout this work that we've done, we would like to share a little bit the public that we've had or who we've reached in 2023, how relevant and how important it is to have regulatory participation in the continent. I'm not going to read them, and we have them here on the screen. And also the intention of continue adding regulatory entities to all the efforts that we do to develop the necessary capabilities for good regulatory practices, as well as in all the technical aspects for medical devices. As you can see, throughout the year, we have the participation of 60 countries worldwide with over 600 representatives of regulatory entities in the nationwide, more than 1,000 of the private sector, and these figures represent the activities up to August of this year. In the next months, we've also had, in the following months to that, we had more activities, especially in the African continent, but that is not shown here. What have we done? Well, basically, we do what we've done most frequently, which is develop capabilities. We carry this out with the support of the FDA, and we had a webinar on the stability of medical devices. All the materials and recordings can be accessed. They are the coalition's website, available to all of you. You can have access to these materials, and through the slides, you can also have access to the session. We had a conversation on good regulatory practices in Peru with the private sector, and we also understood the co-responsibility that we had of everybody being prepared on what good regulatory practices mean for regulators and for the regulated sector. And in Mexico, we also had another dialogue on good regulatory practices. We did this in October past, where we emphasized basically the processes that are being done in Mexico to update Mexican regulatory standards that are quite relevant for the medical devices sector. And in the near future, we're also going to have a second session on stability studies for medical devices, where we're going to be presenting the experience that we had from the industry's point of view. And this is going to be done on November the 30th. Where are we at right now as part of the regulatory project? Well, which is implemented in the Americas. Well, in Brazil, we've had support for all the activities carried out in the region, taking advantage of the experiences that are different, in some cases that are much more advanced than in others in the whole region. And we're also working with them to find new efficiencies in the assessment, conformity evaluation process. This is a process that involves and that includes conversations between Anvisa, Inmetro, NIST, and FDA. In the case of Colombia, this is one of the most important achievements that we had in regulatory convergence, talking about institutionalization of good regulatory practices with the Ministry of Health. And together with them, we developed the Operation Standardized Procedure for Good Regulatory Practices. We are working with them to develop an update to this procedure to include checklists that would allow us to guarantee compliance of all the relevant aspects that have to do with good regulatory practices and the obligations related to them. The results have been so positive that the National Department of Planning, which is the national entity in charge of implementing good regulatory practices, is now taking this as a base to implement this not only nationwide, but in the whole territory. So this means that this procedure is going to help more than 1,500 institutions in Colombia to become all of these good regulatory practices institutionalized. And so we're working with the ministry to align the criteria and the definitions of the different terms that we have in the regulatory framework in Colombia that make important differences in how to treat updating processes for different regulatory instruments. And another good news is that this year, the Ministry of Health of Colombia received an award from the National Planning Department because of all the work that was done regarding the ex post assessment of decrees 4725 and 3770, that, as you all know, it's a framework for all medical devices and diagnosis devices. In Chile, we've been working with them, helping them with the regulation of the IVDs and for HIV and immunohematology, also regulating the traceability that they're developing. In the case of Ecuador, we're also supporting them with updating the outsourcing of processes. In the case of Peru, we also did some work on feedback of the different procedures that are set forth in the requirements to approve medical devices, where we try to have them fully aligned with international standards. And obviously, this is part, we also need to work on developing capabilities for the regulator and the regulated sector. And in the case of Mexico, well, we want to congratulate the COFEPRIS because they've had huge achievements accompanied with a lot of collaboration from different stakeholders. As you all know, last week we announced the acceptance by of the COFEPRIS as an affiliated member of MDSAP, and I want to thank the FDA for all the work that they did to develop the capabilities and to prepare the COFEPRIS so that they could present their request for membership and to get the result that we wanted to get at the end. And to that regards, this announcement of the COFEPRIS of being accepted and accept the audit results of the MDSAP to guarantee good manufacturing practices in the sector is really good. We also congratulate the COFEPRIS for publishing the strategy for regulatory certainty for medical devices. This is something, this is work where they are considering all the support given by the Regulatory Convergence Project and everything, all the information that they've been provided for 2 years, where we also institutionalize for the medical devices area and for the good regulatory committees that have already been established for the drugs area would be implemented for medical devices. And also a checklist was developed for complying with the good regulatory practices. We've done several legal analysis to ensure compliance with good regulatory practices of different instruments generated by the COFEPRIS. And at the end, and even though this is quite recent, and actually the update of the NOM, the Mexican NOM, we want to thank the confirmation from Commissioner Quiroga about incorporating this standard to be reviewed once again as part of the 2024 program. And we want to thank the awareness and the work of the COFEPRIS to be able to do this review. And in the case of the regulated sector, as I was saying, we developed capabilities by applying the knowledge, by knowing how good regulatory practices are applied in Mexico with the regulatory frameworks that already exist in Mexico to this regards. As always, we wanted to present the coalition's website. It's available for all of you. We can find a lot of information in there with trainings, documents, references, which we believe could be really helpful to all of you and to anybody who wants to start getting involved in these topics and who wants to gain some skills and additional knowledge by using the materials that have already been included in our website. And so said that, I want to wrap up my presentation. Thank you. This is the data, the contact information of everybody involved in this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for sharing all the great efforts and very much impactful work that MDRC has been doing in the region. Next, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Camila Gomez, who will be presenting on FIFARMA updates on GRP-related activities in the Latin America region. Camila is a global health and specialist in global health and health regulation. She has a broad experience in regulatory policy, both as government and industry, leading or contributing to bilateral and multilateral negotiations, harmonization, and conversion initiatives. In FIFARMA, the Latin America Federation for Pharmaceutical Industry, she acts as a subject matter expert for good regulatory practices. Welcome, Camila, and feel free to share your screen.
Thank you, Vesa, for this introduction. I'll be speaking in Spanish as well. Hola a todos. Inicialmente, un gran agradecimiento.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the FDA for the promotion and the organization of these webinars. I don't want to repeat what Sandra already mentioned regarding how important good regulatory practices are. But I mean, the nature of the work that we do as a federation of the pharmaceutical industry in Latin America is really similar, you know, as the work that you've been seeing comes out from the coalition. And here I wanted to highlight something before we begin I wanted to highlight the relevance of, from the private sector, how we can be here working with you, you know, in a session promoted by our favorite, our regulator of preference, you know, and because as part of these regulatory activities, we have a really interesting visibility of all the processes and how they occur. So we can collaborate with the regulators in creating new efficiencies and better efficiencies in these processes. And we also have a responsibility as a regulated entity to implement whatever we have to do and to develop good regulatory practices at a national, regional, and global level and make sure that they can progress into the future.
A ver si va a funcionar. Solo necesito una confirmación que ustedes vean
Let me know if you
la
can see my screen,
votación.
please.
Yes, Camila.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Entonces,
Okay,
yo
so
soy miembro
as I was saying, as a member of the working subgroup for good regulatory practices at FIFARMA. So this is just a brief introduction first of FIFARMA so that you can see it. FIFARMA is the Latin America Federation of the Pharmaceutical Industry for Investment and Development. We have 27 members. Some of them include local associations that work directly with the regulators at a local level. And we also have a huge amount of companies included. Many are nationals, others are transnational. We've been in operation since 1962 as a federation. And throughout these years, we've been able to contribute to drive health and to work on health in the Americas. Here we have a work group, or an original work group, which is the work group of Okay, this is the Regulatory and Pharmacovigilance Regulatory Group. And in this regulatory group, we have several axes that are the main pillars that we follow. And those are the ones that I wanted to refer to in this moment, because good regulatory practices are one of the pillars that our association has prioritized and things that need to be worked on here in the region. So FIFARMA supports the adoption of these practices as a tool to strengthen health systems and to achieve better results. So we can see good regulatory practices as something that is really inherent and important as part of the ecosystem that goes further beyond than just the regulatory world. So here we have these different pillars of the FIFARMA regulatory group and the other regulatory pillars go from good regulatory practices and reliance practices that, as Sandra said, are really connected to good regulatory practices, as well as the new sources of evidence for good decision making. So good regulatory practices have an importance in all the discussions that we have, and that's why we have a specific work group for this. And the strategic group objective for all of us working in this group is to support through local associations the regulatory authorities in the region can make progress implementing good regulatory practices for pharmaceutical products. I would like to mention 4 general ways in which we do this. And I'm not going to give you detailed examples, but yes, I'm going to talk about 4 main areas of work. First of all, FIFARMA is an actor that has official relationships. It's a non-state stakeholder that has official relationships with the Pan American Health Organization. So with PAHO. So as a part of our organization, we have included in our 3-year work plan with PAHO how to work with good regulatory practices and what is our commitment as an industry to work and be part of the main stakeholders as part of these regulatory practices. So just imagine all the different actors and stakeholders that are involved here, with official relationships with PAHO as well as with the WHO, and they have agreed, developed plans with them to be able to work in these areas that could benefit both member states of PAHO and all participants involved in each one of the organizations. In our case, we could benefit the pharmaceutical industry. Another important thing, as has already been mentioned before by Sandra, is that we have different collaborations to carry out direct activities with the regulators. Here, I wanted to mention some of the ones that we've done after we had our first webinar with the FDA. We also had a workshop with the local association for industries in Peru, which is ALAFARPE, and with DGMI, the regulatory entity for good regulatory practices. We also participated in a dialogue on Reliance and good regulatory practices in March, in another edition with COFEPRIS and AMIF in Mexico, and in the industry, and also with the regulatory entities for Central America. We've worked with them through Fede Pharma, and we participated in a seminar on reliance and good regulatory practices. So these are just some examples on how we are acting. We always do this in collaboration with the different entities that work locally and that are the main face of the regulator. Other things that we do is we participate in conferences, regional events. So all of you who are participating in different conferences in the region, we'll almost always see somebody there representing FIFARMA or the industry that are there talking about the importance of good regulatory practices. And we also have collaboration with the academic arena. We are exclusively working with a university in Mexico doing a study on the industry's experience regarding the implementation and some of the elements of good regulatory practices done in other countries that have prioritized this in Latin America. We've worked with other regulators in other countries. This is a project that is just beginning, and hopefully we're going to have the necessary data soon to publish and present to everybody, and we want to have specific data that could help us have necessary conversations and in-depth conversations as of next year. All the works that FIFARMA has done regarding the use of good regulatory practices is always registered in a position paper. You're going to receive a copy of all of these slides, and you're going to have a link there to have access to this document that is in English and in Spanish and Portuguese. And so there, we've presented a little bit more of the elements of this document in our past presentation and the first webinar that we have with the FDA. So I'm not going to extend my comments a lot more than what we have in this document, but I do want to talk about in a general overview about future plans. No, we are developing as part of FIFARMA a document on a Q&A document for good practices, regulatory practices, some questions that have to do or that have as an audience not only the regulators that are involved here, but also our colleagues from the industry itself, as Sandra already mentioned. Good regulatory practices are still an area that is really new and that is not known for many regulators and many of our colleagues who work with these regulators. So there's this type of information that could be really useful. And we're also going to have another workshop that we're trying to have in person next year on good regulatory practices with the regulators.
Inicio que nosotros como
To conclude, I told you, like, we as regulated entities, we have the role of collaborating with the regulators to see from the perspective of regulators how to move towards a more efficient, transparent, and flexible regulation. But there's also another commitment as an industry to increase regulatory transparency and efficacy. So I would like to finish by highlighting the practices that we have as an industry. So I call upon regulators who are listening to us. If you believe that we could do more, collaborate more, do different things, we're more than willing and open to receive your suggestions of how to walk this path together. You know, especially because of the pandemic experience, we all learned that the industry has the willingness to collaborate in clinical trials, clinical essays. It is not only the regulators, but also researchers and others. We want people to have access to data, especially in terms of what has to be regulated. One thing we do whenever we have a chance, and it is very important for us to have those chances, is to be able to provide information to the regulators regarding good practices, and also to share whenever possible to public institutions to let them know, to create feedback that is valuable so that we can expand our understanding and we can provide a added value for public consultation processes so that regulators have a more robust regulation and so that it is better adhered to by the regulated entities. We are working on trainings, guidelines, and learning about world practices, especially in the multinational industry. There's collaboration of multiple countries and best practices flourish. And the guidelines, that's where they are created, and we learn from one another. So when we bring that information to Latin America, to the Caribbean, we have lived experience of the guidelines, the standards, and everything. So people don't have to start from scratch. And in terms of monitoring, we can provide timely information in terms of safety, security, and safety and quality, so as to be able to protect the health of patients. And finally, the idea is to participate before the summits in previous meetings, especially when we are walking towards an ecosystem that is increasingly more complex, with products are more complicated. So it is important for us to give ourselves the time to have those discussions before we meet with the regulators, to be on the same page. We know that the speed in which regulation changes, it is not the same speed in which technology changes, but it is important for us to give ourselves the chance to have those discussions with the regulators so that we can make their lives easier when they get the information from us, information that might be new, different, because technologies change, because there are new ways of doing things, of doing research, clinical trials. So that is our commitment in terms of how to improve the regulatory environment so as to promote more efficient and transparent regulation. I think I have run out of time. Apologies if I took longer from FIFARMA. We thank the opportunity to speak here, and we are available in case you have comments, questions, especially to collaborate with all regulators and other stakeholders in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Camila. Very interesting, a lot of work happening. As you mentioned, FIFARMA undertaking a lot of work here in the region regarding good regulatory practices. I found really interesting in the future that you're planning a questionnaire. And I hope, I just want to say that I hope that all our regulatory partners as well as industry take advantage of that and provide input as part of that questionnaire, because I'm sure that we can all use that information and work together to further advance the work on good regulatory practices in our region. Thank
you so much. This is also our
Camila.
expectation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think so far, again, wanted to thank Sandra as well as Camila for, we heard both from MDRC and FIFARMA on all the work that is happening in the region in this space, and really invaluable contributions from both of those organizations in the medical device as well as in pharmaceutical sector. So thank you for that. Here, I would like to kind of transition to our next part of the webinar. I would like to invite Maria Kuchen to provide a talk about using good regulatory practices to inform regulation development and regulatory impact analysis. Maria is a senior economist in FDA's Office of Economics and Analysis within the Office of Commissioner at the FDA. She handles regulatory impact analysis, which involve benefit cost analysis of FDA regulations, and conducts economic analysis of cross-cutting policy issues. Maria, if you're ready, I think we were going to share your slides, I believe. And I think they're coming up right now.
Perfect, thank you.
And while the slides are being shared, I will just take a quick moment to remind everyone that there's a question and answer box that you all can take advantage of putting questions. And then after Maria's presentation, we'll take a minute and discuss those questions and provide answers. So please take advantage of that. We would like, I think it's very valuable to have those questions because it drives discussions in this space. And so I think I'll just say that and hand it over to Maria.
Thank you, Vesa, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I just echo, Vesa's remarks that we're very happy to hear about all of the good work that's being done in the area of good regulatory practices. And we're grateful to be able to be here with you today, to be able to share some of FDA's experience about how we can put good regulatory practices into practice throughout our rulemaking process. So in this presentation in particular, we will be speaking about how FDA gathers high quality information and seeks stakeholder input throughout the regulation development process, which are obviously important aspects of our good regulatory practices. So I'm going to speak about how we implement these processes for both regulations and for regulatory impact analyses. And I'll use an example from a published regulation at the end of the presentation to tie all of these concepts together. We really try to focus on providing practical examples wherever possible. Next slide, please. So we'll just start from a big picture view here. So as a reminder, in the United States, good regulatory practices are rooted in US law known as the Administrative Procedures Act, and they're set forth in trade agreements. So these good regulatory practices, as we heard from our other presenters today, include principles and procedures that address intergovernmental coordination of rulemaking activity, impact assessment, regulatory transparency, stakeholder outreach and engagement, and accountability. And following GRPs really promotes transparency in rulemaking and ensures that FDA coordinates with governmental, with public, international stakeholders to develop and implement regulations that meet our public health objective while also being consistent with US law, policy, and with our trade commitments. Next slide, please.
Sorry, it's not working. Just a second, please.
No worries. Thank you. So high quality information early in the regulation development process and through public comments on proposed regulations helps support effective regulations in a variety of ways. So one of the ways that these practices support good quality regulations is by supporting transparency, accountability, confidence, and trust in the rulemaking process. It helps us to produce a better regulation by allowing those affected to provide input and improve the clarity of regulatory requirements, as well as avoid unintended consequences that might arise. It also provides regulators with data and information to inform rulemaking or regulation development. And it promotes an understanding of how regulatory actions can have impacts beyond a country's borders. So, as I mentioned, one moment, please. Thank you. As I mentioned, this presentation is going to provide some practical examples to identify key principles of good regulatory practice and illustrate how FDA's rulemaking process reflects our good regulatory practices. And I do want to pause here and clarify what I mean by when I refer to regulation or rulemaking. A regulation is a general statement issued by an agency, board, or commission that has the force and effect of law. So you'll hear me often switch between regulation and rulemaking in this presentation. Next slide, please. So to set the stage, I want to, again, taking the big picture view, first touch on the general stages of our rulemaking process for those who are unfamiliar with them. And these include broadly identifying our regulatory priorities and developing a draft regulation, then reviewing that draft regulation, the notice and the comment or the public consultation on the proposed draft regulation, and then the issuance of the final regulation. So in this presentation, just to situate what we're going to be talking about today, we'll focus in particular on how FDA identifies and solicits information when in the stage of developing the draft regulation, and also during the public comment process, since these are very much tied together. Next slide, please. So in developing a draft regulation, FDA may draw on a variety of sources of information and input. And these include scientific literature and data analysis, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So of course, we aim to use the best available peer-reviewed scientific literature, studies, and data. Want to mention also that we may use internal data. And when doing so, we may include memoranda to the rulemaking that describe FDA's reasoning and analysis of that data and communicate this information as transparently as possible to our stakeholders when they're reviewing that information during the public consultation process. In certain cases, we make use of surveys and pilot studies. So FDA may conduct or commission surveys and pilot studies to gain insight into the feasibility of potential regulatory changes. And those studies would be subject to the Paperwork Reduction Act, reviewing the burden of such collections of information from the public to ensure that we would not overburden the public with these particular requests. I also want to highlight that FDA may consult with an established advisory committee to obtain independent expert advice on scientific, technical, or policy matters. FDA has 31 advisory committees that are either mandated by statute or established at the discretion of the Department of Health and Human Services. And these are comprised of academic and industry experts, as well as public health advocates and patient representatives. So some examples of FDA advisory committees are the Human Drug Advisory Committees, the Food Advisory Committee, Science Board to the Food and Drug Administration. And we also have many more narrowly defined committees, such as the Cellular Tissue and Gene Therapies Advisory Committee as well. Moving on, FDA may also issue what are known as formal requests for information, and those would be to solicit feedback, data, and information and allow for stakeholders to submit comments on specific topics that would inform the development of regulations or even inform our thinking about potential regulations very early in the stage, even before a regulation might be developed. So those can be very useful tools for gathering information, both scientific, but also feedback from public and from industry stakeholders. Relatedly, FDA conducts listening sessions and public meetings as well. So if we may hold listening sessions, public meetings, public workshops to invite the public's input on topics addressed in proposed and final regulations, as well as facilitate and support public participation in the rulemaking process. And our second presentation that will follow after this, we'll talk a little bit in more detail about those processes. Finally, touching on very important participation in international initiatives and dialogue. So when developing regulations, FDA may draw on experiences and discussions from our participation in international initiatives such as ICH, International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, and the IMDRF, International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So these are just a couple of examples, but such international forums such as these really can contribute to greater regulatory harmonization, especially in this stage as regulations are being developed. And that closely relates to the fact that FDA does consider scientific and voluntary consensus standards when we are developing the regulation. So these are some of the many inputs that we do consider when we are in the stage of drafting a proposed rule. Next slide, please. So in addition to the information described on the previous slide, we also wanted to touch on how FDA might draw on additional sources of information when developing an economic analysis for a proposed regulation. When an economic analysis is required, the development of the preliminary regulatory impact analysis begins early in the rulemaking process as well. And a well-conducted regulatory impact analysis can serve to develop evidence that will support well-informed decision-making, but it also serves and supplies a record of the data, assumptions, and analyses considered, not just in the economic analysis, but also within the rule itself. So some of the sources of information that may contribute to the development of a regulatory impact analysis would be, similar to the previous slide, stakeholder feedback on economic impacts that would be provided through those listening sessions, public meetings, public comments. We do pay careful attention to the comments and input that bear directly on the potential impacts of a proposed regulation. We'll also look at the scientific and economic literature on the particular topic. We may reference data sources such as publicly available data sets that are maintained by the federal government agencies. When possible, we may extrapolate from similar regulations, policies, or analyses. So this can be at a general level, looking at good manufacturing practices, for example, and how that implementation might have occurred in other sectors. Or it might be a little bit more retrospective, where we would look at controls that are already in place in a particular industry or sector and think about whether those same impacts would be applicable in the context of the new regulation that is being developed. So really relying on the existing real-world evidence that is out there to inform our economic analyses is one of the best practices that we use. When possible, and if it's relevant, we also rely on experimental or quasi-experimental evidence. So that refers to quantitative models that would shed light on the efficacy of a potential proposed approach, as well as models that look at the effects of various interventions or particular interventions on the behavior of consumers and the behavior of firms, so that we're using these impacts to really inform what we expect to happen prospectively in the analysis of a proposed regulation. We may also use surveys, so how those affected would respond to proposed policies or changes. That might also include internet surveys that require, more limited resources to be able to conduct and make them much maybe more feasible or quicker to conduct. And last, I want to mention expert elicitations, which can be a good tool. And these are formal structured processes to obtain expert judgment on specific questions or issues, usually from a select group of experts who know a topic area well. So these are some of the ways that we pull information together into the economic analysis for a proposed regulation. Next slide, please. I want to pause for a minute as well before I start talking in more detail about the public consultation process, just to highlight that throughout the rulemaking process, the FDA's goal is to engage all relevant stakeholders. And really, the more comments FDA receives that can address the substance and the specifics of the proposed rule, the better the final rule at the end of the day. So some examples of key stakeholders on this slide would be consumers and patients, domestic and foreign industry, state, local, or tribal governments within the US, foreign governments, including regulatory counterparts, academics and research institutions, and other public interest groups. Next slide, please. So now I'll move to talking a little bit about the public consultation process before we get into an example that will sort of tie all these concepts together, looking at a final regulation the FDA published recently. So to start, every proposed regulation has a docket set up at regulations.gov. And we can think of the docket like a collection of documents related to a rulemaking or other action, sort of like a virtual filing cabinet. And our next presentation will provide a little bit more information on dockets and where they can be found online. So documents posted by the agency in the docket include the proposed or final regulation, as well as any references. So the docket also serves as a repository for the public comments received too. And maintaining this information in one location allows for greater transparency and for ease of public comment, because all of the information that the public might need to reference can be found in one location. As I mentioned earlier with the request for information, for example, FDA may also open a docket to receive comments on specific topics that are outside of a specific rulemaking or in the pre-development stage of rulemaking. Any stakeholder can use regulations.gov to submit a comment on a proposed regulation, and that includes foreign entities, individuals, regulatory counterparts. And the comments posted in the docket are publicly available. However, there are provisions allowing commenters to notify the agency if a comment contains confidential information. Also want to note that comments received through the WTO, World Trade Organization, inquiry point on a proposed rule from another WTO member during the comment period are also incorporated into the docket. And the comment period itself typically ranges from 90 to 120 days on a proposed regulation. And we often receive requests to extend the comment period, and we typically make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. But the goal is really to ensure that we're providing our stakeholders with ample time to digest the information in the proposed rule and to have adequate time to prepare substantive comments. Next slide, please. So FDA reviews every comment filed during the comment period, and obviously comments that are not received in the docket before the end of the comment period are not considered. The volume of comments can sometimes number into the thousands. So similar to other federal agencies, FDA does have a process of addressing comments that generally follows certain steps, which are laid out on this slide. And I do want to touch on this because it's important for understanding not only how we gather all of this feedback together, but also how we respond to it, which we're going to speak about a little bit later. So first, we'll collect all the comments received during the comment period, and then we will organize the comments, consolidate any duplicate submissions, any form letters, and identify comments that are unrelated to or outside the scope of the proposed rule. We will then identify issues raised by each substantive comment and categorize those issues by topic so that comments on the same topic can be addressed together. At that point, we'll prepare high-level summaries of comments received and identify specific recommendations as well as additional studies, data, and analysis. So I touched on this earlier, and I will continue to touch on this throughout the presentation, but comments that provide evidence, provide rationale, are substantive, generally provide more insight for FDA's consideration. So leaving adequate time and providing adequate information for stakeholders to provide those comments really does produce a better final regulation in the end. So at this stage, following the summaries, we'll discuss internally and prepare recommended responses, which would include explanations for why the agency incorporates or does not incorporate comments recommendations into the final rule. And after considering the substantive comments, we would draft the final rule and clearly reference any changes within the response to comments. I'm not going to get into the final drafting phase today, but I just want to note that if after reviewing public comments, if the rule moves to the final drafting phase, the preamble to the final rule includes responses to comments that are received during the comment period that are within the scope of the rulemaking. And just as following the process that I described here, these responses are typically organized by topic and will also describe any changes to the rule due to the comments received. Next slide, please. So what we'll do now is look at some examples from a recently published regulation to demonstrate how FDA gathered high-quality information and solicited stakeholder input when developing the proposed and final regulations. And not only how we solicited input, but also how we responded and incorporated that input into the final rule. So by way of background, in 2017, the FDA Reauthorization Act directed FDA to establish a category of over-the-counter OTC hearing aids through rulemaking and set forth various requirements for these OTC hearing aids. So in August of 2022, FDA finalized a regulation establishing the regulatory category for OTC hearing aids and making related amendments to update the regulatory framework for hearing aids. So we'll be using this example today and walking through the history of this rulemaking and the public comments. Next slide, please. In October of 2021, so before the rule was finalized in 2022, FDA proposed in the proposed rule or proposed regulation multiple regulatory changes, which included proposing requirements for OTC hearing aids that would serve to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of hearing aids and also address barriers to access to hearing aids. And although that proposed rule in 2021 was the first sort of formal step in the regulation development process, this proposed rule followed many other steps that FDA had already taken in years prior to initiate an update of the regulatory framework for hearing aids. So, for example, FDA considered a report from 2015 by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology on the public health implications of hearing loss in adults. In 2016, FDA, along with other federal agencies and a consumer advocacy group, co-sponsored a study that was entitled Hearing Healthcare for Adults, Priorities for Improving Access and Affordability. And that was through the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Additionally, if you recall what I mentioned a few slides ago about public listening sessions and public workshops, FDA held a public workshop in 2016 that was on streamlining regulations for good manufacturing practices for hearing aids. And as part of that public workshop, we requested comments on several topics related to hearing healthcare technology and improved access, including the appropriate level of GMP regulation. And we received hundreds of comments to that docket. So workshop speakers and submitters were generally healthcare professionals or healthcare professional organizations, members of industry, patients, consumers, academics, consensus standard developers, and science organizations. So a wide variety of participation and several years prior to when the proposed rule was actually published. In another effort to address the current regulatory framework, FDA also issued a guidance document related to conditions for sale for air conduction hearing aids, on which we also received stakeholder feedback. So as you can see in the years of developing the proposed rule, FDA considered input and questions received on the guidance, as well as comments from a public workshop and recommendations from multiple research studies. And all of this is described in the published regulations, which you can find at the link on the slides. Next slide, please. So following publication of the proposed rule, we received more than 1,000 comments by the close of the comment period, which was in January of 2022. We also notified this regulation to the WTO under the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. And our commenters included, much as in the public workshop, consumers, professionals, professional associations, hearing aid manufacturers, public health organizations, advocacy groups, and members of Congress and state agencies as well. In our responses to the comments in the preamble, FDA grouped similar comments by topic, and for ease of reference, we assigned a number to each issue raised by the commenters within that topic. So comment 1, comment 2, together with FDA's response. At the end, sort of going through that process that we discussed earlier, the preamble to the final rule included 134 unique comment responses, which also included a handful of comments on the regulatory impact analysis as well. We also want to note, as we do, not in this rule, but in our other rules that we publish, that the number assigned to each comment within a topic is purely for organizational purposes. So comment 1 does not signify that that first comment is more important or came in first, or does not signify anything in particular about the order in which we receive the comments or the comments value. So here I'm going to touch on a few examples to demonstrate how we took comments into account. So first, we'll look at examples on this slide of comments that contributed to changes in the final rule. So in the proposed regulation, warnings to consumers regarding signs and symptoms that should prompt a consultation with a licensed physician referred to an ear specialist, as you can see in the first example on the left-hand side. Multiple comments suggested that ear specialist was not specific enough because it might imply that somebody besides a physician, and that could confuse or mislead hearing aid users. So the comments proposed that labeling refer to an ear, nose, throat doctor, ENT, or similar terms. In the final regulation, FDA revised the labeling throughout to follow the comment suggestion. And in our response to the comments, we noted that we agreed that ear, nose, throat doctor and ENT were more descriptive and likely more common than the phrase ear specialist. In the second example, in the proposed regulation, FDA proposed a maximum output level of 115 decibel sound pressure level for OTC hearing aids. FDA received many comments on this subject, all of which are summarized in the final regulations, in the preamble to the final regulation, some of which included references to published scientific literature, consensus standards, stakeholder position papers, and public health guidelines. After further considering the potential risk of worsening users' hearing impairments, as well as literature submitted to us in the comments, FDA decided to finalize lower output limits than we originally proposed. In our response, we noted that the output limits we finalized balance safety and effectiveness without unduly sacrificing either. And we explained that we did not adopt the even lower limits suggested in some comments because these lower limits would reduce device effectiveness for people with perceived mild to moderate hearing aid impairment to such a degree that the limits would actually exclude some intended users from obtaining sufficient benefits from the hearing aids. So we shared these examples to show how public comments can influence the content of the final regulation. The result of the first example was to make labeling more user-friendly. The second example resulted in a better balance between safety and effectiveness. So in the case of output levels, as I mentioned earlier, additional evidence is very useful. And the additional evidence provided by the comments was particularly impactful for FDA's consideration of the suggested changes. Next slide, please. So now we'll look at how FDA responded to comments that did not ultimately contribute to changes in the final regulation. In these cases, our general approach is to engage with the substance of the comment and offer a detailed and responsive explanation of FDA's position. So in the first example, the regulation proposed requiring expected battery life to be included on the labeling inside the package. A few comments suggested removing this requirement, and they expressed concern that estimating the expected battery life would be difficult for manufacturers due to inconsistencies between batteries and use conditions. However, FDA decided to maintain this requirement in the final regulation. So in our response to comments, FDA recognized that battery performance can vary, but retain this requirement because this information will help prospective purchasers determine whether a hearing aid will be suitable for their circumstances. And in the response, recognizing that performance can vary from device to device, we noted that we're not requiring a specific method of estimating the battery life. And our response also referred manufacturers to an example of a standard that provided an acceptable measure to estimate battery life. In the second example, we proposed not to limit the device gain, which is how much the device amplifies or reduces the input. Multiple comments instead recommended that FDA adopt a gain limit. And these comments stated that a limit would improve the device safety by further reducing the risks of over amplification, primarily due to the device reaching its gain limit and providing no further amplification before it reached the output limit. So in other words, a gain limit would lower the output limit from the device. However, in the final regulation, FDA did not finalize a separate gain limit. And in our response to comments, which is very detailed, and I would refer you to the final regulation, the preamble to the final regulation to really read through that if you're interested. In our response to comments, FDA acknowledged that the gain limit may play a role in the management of risks from over-amplification, but a gain limit also reduces the ability of the device to adequately amplify soft sounds in some cases, which can lead to decreased effectiveness and user satisfaction. Additionally, the appropriate gain for the device would depend on the design and features. So imposing a limit may constrain device design and innovation, which could have an undesirable effect on the benefit for the intended users. Our response also made note to the fact that the intended users are a varied population with a range of hearing and communication needs. So again, by not imposing or requiring a gain limit, the broadest range of intended users would have access to the effective devices, and the flexibility would empower users to customize hearing aids to their needs. So we bring up these examples because we want to highlight that even in the cases where FDA did not ultimately adopt the approach suggested by the comments in the final regulation, we aimed to be as responsive as possible in describing our rationale and in offering additional clarification for our decision-making process to be as transparent as possible. Next slide, please, for the final example. So I did want to touch on comments received on the economic analysis, the preliminary regulatory impact analysis for the proposed regulation. In this case, we received a small number of comments on the preliminary regulatory impact analysis, which we addressed in the final regulatory impact analysis. So in this example, the comment suggested that the analysis use a different estimate for the percentage of hearing aid owners with perceived mild to moderate hearing impairment than the estimate that was used in the original analysis. So from our response, you can see that if you take a minute to read it there, you can see how we engage directly to explain that the suggested input was not appropriate for this analysis because it related to professional assessments from clinical settings rather than perceptions of hearing aid owners directly, which was the relevant metric for estimating the impact of this particular regulation. So I wanted to highlight this example to show that we also aim to be as responsive as possible to comments received on the economic analysis. And although this particular comment did not result in changes to the analysis, there are many instances where we are able to incorporate comment suggestions. And again, that is dependent on the quality of the information provided in the comment and the detail and the references provided in the comment. So again, it really emphasizes the importance of allowing adequate time for stakeholders to review and digest the information in proposed regulations. The next slide, please. So I'll wrap up here just to emphasize that high quality information, especially early in the regulation development process, but also through public comments on the proposed regulation, supports better regulations. And maintaining a consistent approach in addressing public comments and a consistent process can provide certainty to stakeholders as well as contribute to transparency in FDA's decision-making process that we're able to communicate to our stakeholders. So hopefully from the case of the OTC hearing aid regulation, you can see how FDA considered multiple types of information, evidence, input as we developed the regulation, as well as how we responded to the comments on the proposed regulation that may or may not have resulted in changes to the final regulation. And we hope that by sharing these examples, we've given you greater insight to how we implement our good regulatory practices at FDA. And I will stop here and I'm happy to address any comments you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Really great presentation, and I thought it was really helpful as you ran through one of the examples and how FDA has implemented and conducted the regulatory impact analysis. I think we have a couple questions here. At this point, I would like to also invite our international regulatory analyst, Patty Pineda, to also join us to also help with the question and answer part. And perhaps she can help us read the questions in Spanish.
Sure.
Thank
So
you,
the
Patty.
first question, Maria, is does the FDA has a maximal time established for a document to be under public consultation?
Let me unmute myself there. Thank you. Yeah, so we typically, the comment period typically ranges from 90 to 120 days.
Great.
And it can be extended. We may extend, as I mentioned, on a case-by-case basis for another few months.
Okay, good. Thank you. So the next question is, I would like to know for how long or how often the FDA reviews their regulation to know if their regulation needs to be updated or not.
That's a great question. Thank you. We'll periodically review regulations. It really, I would say it depends on, it's more of a case-by-case basis about the feedback that we're receiving from our stakeholders, as well as what we're seeing in our enforcement of our particular regulation, about whether a regulation might need either to be revised, but often what we might see is there might be additional clarification that's needed. So we might provide what's known as a guidance document, which are non-binding documents that share FDA's thinking on a particular topic, and that might aid our stakeholders with their compliance. For example, if we find that something in the regulation seems to be unclear or needs to be clarified a little bit, considering maybe a change in technology or a change in testing techniques, something along those lines. And in our next presentation, Kristen is going to share a little bit more about our guidance documents and what goes into that process too.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We don't have any more questions at this point. And if you let me just in Spanish, les recordamos que pueden hacer sus preguntas, por favor, en la cajita de preguntas y respuestas.
If you have any questions, you can ask your questions in the Q&A session. Take advantage of the fact that we have our speakers here so that you can ask all the questions that you might have. Anyway, after this presentations, we're going to have another Q&A session in case there's still something pending or something you want to clarify of the presentations that have been done so far. Thank you. We go back to Vesa.
Thank you so much, Patty. I guess maybe one more question for Maria that I had that may add some additional clarification. During the public meetings, how does FDA handle those comments, and are they handled the same way as maybe through the docket and written comments? If you could clarify that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Kristen's also going to touch on it in the presentation that will follow. So just as a preview, usually we will provide, create a docket for meetings and other events, and we may post allow comments to be submitted to that docket prior to the meeting occurring. And FDA usually provides on our website a transcript recording of other of our meetings so that there is a record that others can access following the actual event itself.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria, for clarifying that. And I just taking a moment, as Patty mentioned, we will have some more time at after the next speaker. So if there's any questions that you had that we didn't get to, please feel free to put it in the box, and we'll be sure to address it later on. I would highly encourage you to put the questions and take advantage of Maria as well as Kristen being here and providing their expertise. Thank you, Maria. I would like to switch over to our next speaker, Kristen Callahan, who's going to discuss how FDA communicates regulatory information with stakeholders. A quick introduction regarding Kristen. She's a public health advisor in the Office of Trade and Global Partnerships at the FDA Office of Global Policy and Strategy. She previously has served as an international relations specialist in the FDA India office and was a lead regulatory counsel in the Center of Drugs Evaluation and Research at the FDA. Kristen, welcome, and feel free to kind of take it over, share your screen.
Thank you so much, and so happy to be here. I cannot believe how punctual Maria was. It really ended only with 2 minutes over. I'm really impressed because that was a lot of material. So today we're going to be talking about how FDA communicates with stakeholders during the rulemaking process. And I was listening to the questions that were being asked after Maria's presentation, and I hope some of the material that you'll hear from me today will also support the answers that were already provided. And it really, the communication piece is a really important component of good regulatory practices because it's really promoting transparency as well as encouraging stakeholder involvement. And so I hope the essence of that really comes through as we go through these slides. I think one thing to keep in mind when listening to this is that the essential part of good regulatory practices is accessibility and consistent communication. And not only does it facilitate public participation, but it also promotes accountability and transparency on behalf of the agency throughout the rulemaking process, both at the beginning and all the way through to the end, to the finalization. The communication can provide greater certainty to stakeholders and convey important regulatory requirements, such as transitional periods and effective dates. Those are important things that need to be communicated so that industry or whoever is the affected stakeholder can really understand when they need to start compliance if it's finalized. Adherence to these good regulatory practices is essential also for building trust and confidence in regulatory actions to promote and protect public health. Next slide, please. So hot off the, I don't know, next slide. Will that happen? So hot off the presses.
Just a second, please.
Okay, no problem. There we go. Okay, so hot off the presses of back in July of this year, so just a couple months ago, we issued the U.S. government through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs issued a guidance that touches on this very idea of accessibility and consistent communication. Can we actually go to the next slide, please? And so, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, it's an office that's under the government's central authority to review executive branch regulations. And so it issued this guidance essentially on how agencies like FDA, but not specific to FDA, how we can better engage with members of the public when developing regulation, including members of underserved communities. One aspect of this guidance focuses on ensuring agency policies on communication during the rulemaking process, promote accessibility, equitable and meaningful participation and engagement, especially early on in the setting of regulatory priorities, in the early stages of the rule development before a proposed regulation is even issued for comment. And although the availability of online platforms for commenting on a regulation logistically makes it straightforward for any individual with access to the internet to comment, individuals that are interested or affected communities may not always be aware of the opportunity to actually provide comments. Encouraging greater participation by and engagement of underserved communities can provide important benefits to the agencies and the public as a whole. And really what that means is better rulemaking is better for all involved. Next slide, please. So there are barriers that impede greater stakeholder participation in the process, especially for the underserved communities, and includes lack of awareness or knowledge about the regulatory process and opportunities for input, specific regulations or issues that the agency is starting to consider, and effective ways of participating. So even if individuals are clear on the forms of input that would be most helpful, they may also face other barriers as well, such as barriers that it takes time to actually participate. So if there's a participation opportunities that may conflict with work or family care, language or communication access. So if the material is only provided in one language and the underserved population only speaks a different language, that could create a language barrier. If the materials are not written in plain language or an accessible format. So plain language, I mean like clear, concise writing, trying to keep it simple, even if the technical ideas can be complex. physical access related to transportation, distance, or venue accessibility for in-person communication, and internet access, accessibility, and digital literacy for online communication. And then the last that I wanted to mention is the lack of trust in federal agencies or government due to, for instance, negative past interactions with government, that agencies won't take public comments seriously. We are all trying to combat this as regulators and really trying to instill trust. And by promoting transparency, we really hope that we address these barriers that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. So this guidance that I was mentioning from the Office of Information and, excuse me, the guidance recommends that agencies plan and prioritize their participation and engagement activities, focusing on encouraging participation and engagement that makes effective use of agency and community resources and time. This means recognizing that engagement strategies may be different for each regulation, and that in some cases it may be more useful to focus on engagement on broad policy areas, on regulatory programs, rather than each regulation in isolation. So for instance, by inviting public engagement around the broad set of issues an agency is considering through the regulation process. Above all, OIRA recommends that agencies intentionally plan and prioritize their regulatory activities to determine where they should direct resources to maximize the quality of participation and engagement, including the underserved communities, recognizing that a degree of appropriate participation and engagement among the regulations may vary. So in this presentation, we will first focus on how FDA provides early communication about regulations, as well as examples of how we use different avenues or different vehicles of communication methods to reach different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So Maria had already mentioned in the last presentation about the Federal Register, but to just reemphasize again, it's essentially the US version of the official daily publication for agency rules, proposed rules, notices of federal agencies and organizations, as well as executive orders coming from the US President's office. The Federal Register can be found on online at www.federalregister.gov. And also Maria covered in her presentation, but I think it's important again to stop for a second and note, when we talk about regulations, our definition in the United States for regulation is a general statement issued by an agency that has the force and effect of law. And so in other words, we view them as binding. In the Federal Register, the federal government publishes semi-annual agendas of upcoming regulations. It's usually in the spring and the fall. So every 6 months, you'll see a unified agenda announced. And that's also found online at reginfo.gov. Next slide, please. So the unified agenda provides information about new regulations that the government is considering and existing regulations that the government is currently reviewing. So in other words, I view it as kind of like a tip off to anyone who looks at the unified agenda, that here are the things that the agency is actively looking at, and you might see something come out in the next 6 months. Activities included in the agenda generally are those that have regulatory action within the next 12 months. Agencies may choose to include activities that will have a longer time frame than the 12 months. Agency agendas will also show action or reviews completed or withdrawn from the last unified agenda. So if it's mentioned in the previous one and it's been withdrawn, you'll see that it will actually be marked as withdrawn on the agenda. The agenda provides a regular opportunity for OIRA and agencies to communicate to the public about the priorities of the agency, describing the problems or needs to be addressed through regulation, the potential regulatory proposals, and the anticipated costs and benefits. The online unified agenda offers really a flexible search tool, and you can look back at past agendas even dating back from 1995. In addition to serving as a planning tool, the agenda promotes transparency, facilitates public engagement from a very early stage, and allows the public to track planned rulemaking from beginning to end. Next slide, please. So this slide, you're looking at FDA's website, and on our webpage, we maintain an updated agenda of the agency's upcoming rulemaking. Our website includes the formal title of the rulemaking, the projected publication date, and the stage of the rulemaking, which can include the pre-rule, the proposed rule, the final rule, completed actions, and long-term action. It's really a one-stop shop if you're only interested in FDA's unified agenda. Next stop. In addition to making early planning information available, a related site, regulations.gov, provides information on the development of federal regulations and all related documents issued by the US government. And so through this site, the public can find, read, and comment on regulatory issues available on regulations.gov. Next slide, please. So Maria had also talked about the docket, and so we'll briefly talk about it here, but I think she covered it pretty well, which is a docket is essentially what we were saying is the virtual filing cabinet. It's a collection of documents related to a rulemaking or other action. FDA may also open a docket to receive comments on specific topics outside of a specific rulemaking, or if we're in the pre-development stage of rulemaking. Documents posted by an agency in the docket include the proposed or final regulation and any references. And Maria also mentioned that it's essentially a repository for all public comments received. And really, I want to emphasize that that is an amazing resource to have when you are an interested party, to see what other comments there are, and you can actually read them. Most people, when they make a comment onto the docket, they don't mark it as confidential. There is an option to mark something as confidential if there's, business secrets that they do not want to share, but would still like to provide a comment. Maintaining relevant information in one location really provides an accessible record of the inputs that go into the rulemaking process. And that often spans years. Using a docket also allows for greater transparency and ease of public comment, and provides certainty through the use of consistent and standardized communication platforms. So people know where to go, they know where to expect to see rulemaking happen, instead of if they keep changing essentially the venue, the website hosting the rulemaking process. On this slide, you can see there's an example of a docket for a final regulation on spinal steers. The comments posted into the docket are publicly available, like I was mentioning before, and any stakeholder can submit a comment. So it could be foreign entities, it could be domestic entities, individuals, companies, regulatory counterparts. Also to mention, comments received through the WTO inquiry point on a proposed rule from another WTO member during the comment period are also incorporated into this docket that you see here. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I would like to talk about the approaches to clear communication. You can see that from our regulatory development process, we rely heavily on online platforms to make relevant information available. However, we also accept written comments to the agency. And in addition to early planning process, we'll provide examples of a variety of approaches FDA uses to maintain clear, consistent communication throughout the rulemaking lifecycle. So plain language, I do want to stop. We get a lot of comments or questions about this from other regulators. So in the United States, by law, draft regulation and other agency documents must abide by the principles of plain writing. And plain writing is what we think as clear, concise, well-organized communication that the public can understand and use, and follow other best practices appropriate to the subject or field in intended audiences. There's actually a US law that came out in 2010 that requires that all federal agencies use clear government communication that the public can understand and use. And so with that, that means that government agencies should use reader-friendly information that you can easily understand, and documents that you can easily find when you need them, and information you can readily use and act on. We get questions about this from other regulators because rules can be very technical, especially when we're talking about pharmaceuticals and devices. And so how does the plain language here that we're talking about fit into that? And really, it doesn't change anything about the technical requirements or language that is needed in the rule, but it could mean that the preamble, the idea of introducing this introductory information in the rulemaking process. So, we use like essentially a summary and background information before we introduce a draft rule, and we'll try and keep that as clear and concise as possible so that the reader understands, like, here's a technical rule, but here's why the agency is doing it, and here's kind of a boiled down version of the intended objective, as well as the breakdown of the rule. Next slide, please. So accessibility. Federal agencies are responsible for ensuring their information and services are accessible to the persons with disabilities. So what does that mean to be accessible? Accessibility can be measured by how successfully a person with a disability can locate, get to, and understand the wanted or needed information. Accessibility results in benefits like eliminating those barriers I was talking about, barriers to information and communication technology, and encouraging development of technologies and techniques. Who isn't impacted by inaccessible content? A disability is any condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. Recognized groups of disabilities include, for example, cognitive impairment, deaf or limited hearing, blind or limited vision, nonverbal or limited speech, and limited reach and length. FDA's website includes accessibility guidances as well as checklists for creating accessible documents. And this is a snapshot of the FDA website. Next slide, please. So here I want to turn to FDA's website and how that is actually a vehicle for information as well. FDA's website generally includes information related to proposed and final rulemaking, including links to the Federal Register notice and the docket that we have mentioned, the ability to register for automatic email updates, so you can get essentially on like a listserv if there's a particular area you're interested in, as well as other information that can support the understanding of a proposed and final regulation. We also communicate to stakeholders through constituent and listserv email updates, social media, and fact sheets. What you see here is a snapshot of FDA's information about the example from Maria's presentation, the over-the-counter hearing aids. Our website includes other information to support compliance, such as forms, guidance documents, which I'll talk about in a second, tools, and trainings. And this may be targeted at a specific group or population, such as small businesses. For example, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, we have an office called the Small Business and Industry Assistance Office, and often they have on their sub-site on the FDA site a one-stop shop for any small pharmaceutical business that's trying to contact the agency, and it provides a direct communication resources and links to websites and trainings, news, and updates. I should mention that anyone can really use this resource. You don't necessarily have to be a small business to use this tool. FDA's website also includes preliminary and final regulatory impact analyses dating back to 2012 in a searchable format. I want to pause here and take moment. That is a huge deal. That's amazing that we have this searchable tool. So if you're a regulator interested in, or industry interested to understand better our regulatory impact assessment and the whole process that went into a specific rule, we have a searchable tool now where you can pull out all that information. Next slide. Here's an example. Here's a snapshot of what I was just describing about that searchable tool for regulatory impact analyses. Next slide, please. Meetings, conferences, and workshops. FDA may hold a listening session and public meetings to facilitate and support the public participation of a proposed rule, as well as public workshops to communicate about a final regulation. So we've already drafted it, it's gone into final publication, and now we're using public workshops as a way to communicate more information about it. These events usually are virtual or in person, and our website typically includes information on the participation, such as the type of session, obviously the date, information for registration, and other details about the topics and speakers. We may also be soliciting input for speakers. Stakeholders also have the ability to submit comments to a docket associated with the meeting, either electronically or by mail. And following the meeting, FDA will make those recordings and transcripts available on our website. I believe Maria also mentioned that in our the previous presentation. So examples of passive events include a webinar to provide information on the proposed rule regarding laboratory developed tests, public workshop to obtain public input on the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards and pre-market submissions for medical devices, and lastly, a public workshop to communicate how to use and reference standards and device submissions. Next slide, please. We've talked about guidance documents through my presentation. I know Maria mentioned it as a way of another tool for communication. So I'd like to stop here and talk about that for a second. When we talk about guidance documents, we're essentially talking about documents that FDA provides that outline recommendations to FDA staff, applicants and sponsors in the public that represent FDA's current thinking on a topic. That these guidance documents do not create or convert any rights for or any person, and do not operate to bind FDA or the public. So essentially they are non-binding recommendations. In general, guidances provide recommendations and examples that inform stakeholders about issues that relate to the design, production, labeling, promotion, manufacturing, and testing of regulated products. The processing, content, and evaluation or approval of submissions and inspection and enforcement policies are also considered a part of guidances. Similar to good regulatory practices, FDA has good guidance practices, and it really lays out FDA's policies and procedures about developing, issuing, and using guidance documents. Industry, consumers, and other stakeholders can play a significant role in the agency's guidance development process, and FDA welcomes stakeholders and suggestions of topics for guidances. Draft proposals can often help the agency better understand stakeholders' position. I especially have benefited from this as a regulatory counsel when we've received comments on a draft guidance about where maybe confusion lies and how we can better communicate how FDA intends to implement a policy. Excuse me. In some instances, FDA may hold public meetings or workshops on the guidances to solicit additional comments, or it may present draft guidances to an advisory committee for review. Because guidances support industry effort to comply with law and to develop new products, this may benefit the public health. They must be relevant, timely, and easy for stakeholders to find. So we actually have a repository of all our guidances available on our website, which is a snapshot here on this slide. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, I really hope that this presentation shows how FDA communicates with our stakeholders early and throughout the rulemaking process and the development stage, as well as making sure how we make sure the use of variety of approaches to maintain clear, consistent communication throughout the life cycle of a regulation. Consistent with transparency communication through standards, methods, and platforms contributes to predictability and certainty among stakeholders about how to engage an agency, and is really a foundation to our good regulatory practices. So on this slide, you can find resources that I've mentioned throughout this conversation, the federalregister.gov, FDA's own unified agenda, as well as regulations.gov, information about our plain writing, the 2010 law that I mentioned, as well as the databases about with guidances, as well as the regulatory impact analysis. So with that, I will conclude, and we can open up for Q&A for both me and Maria.
Thank you, Kristen. Really great presentation. Thank you for that. I think we did get a couple of questions so far. Perhaps Patty can also jump here as well and help with those questions. Again, happy to take more questions. We do have a little bit of time left. And so really encouraging people to put a question on the chat. Go ahead, Patty.
Gracias. So the first question is, has ever occurred that derived from a public consultation, a product is not marketed, considering that the public is the one that is going to be using the product? Or do the agency tries to convince them, the public, using the scientific information to use the product?
I think we have to take a step back about when we use rulemaking, and it's broader than a specific product. Rulemaking is about essentially the broader approach of how we're going to implement either a law, or like Maria was describing, we find that there's a public health priority, and that's why we're going to do rulemaking. It's not so much about a specific product or encouraging the public to use a specific product. It's our mission at FDA is to have safe, effective, and good quality products for the public health. And so it's not, we are not, healthcare providers. That's really between the patients and their healthcare provider. What we do is essentially evaluate the applications, and the rulemaking process is about the broader process, not a product specific to one application or one specific applicant. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so.
See, okay.
Thank
So
you.
then, and if not, they have the chance to make a follow-up question. So the next question is, they are thanking for the presentation, and they'd like to know from FDA and also from the industry, what would you suggest for a regulator that wants to start or advance in the GRP implementation?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's a really important question. I personally, this is my personal opinion, but I think, the transparency piece is really about early public consultation process, and at least allowing comments to come in during the draft phase. And so, today we've talked about different tools that we use. So, FDA has its website, we have the unified agenda. I know it's a lot, but essentially I think that the essence of it is having information publicly available, most likely online, being that that's the easiest way for folks to access information, and having information early in the rulemaking process and not when it's at the final period. I talked at the start of the presentation about essentially there's this new guidance out that tells U.S. agencies how to better get involvement from stakeholders And really, I think that should resonate internationally, not just to US agencies. It's really about getting the word out there early on the rulemaking process, so that you have time to actually incorporate comments in if appropriate. Sometimes we don't get actually a lot of comments in just because we got it right on the first time, but at least we've given folks an opportunity to actually comment, and so that we can consider them.
I
would
also
add
just,
to, oh, go ahead,
sorry,
Faiza.
Mariah. I was going to mention that just a reminder, this was the second series of a second webinar of the series that we had. And for those of you that maybe did not participate in the first series, Kristen and Sandra really provided the fundamentals regarding GRPs. And so I think it's important to invite those that did not participate, perhaps to go back and also listen to that webinar as well, because it does provide some of the fundamentals to think about regarding GRPs. So just one, I just wanted to mention that, and we're happy to share the links of those of the previous webinar as well, when the link to this webinar is available too, just to have those. And Maria, I think you also were going to jump in.
Sure. I wanted to add also, thinking from the perspective of regulatory impact analysis, also involving economists early in the rulemaking process is very critical for developing quality analyses and quality regulations. And you don't want to be at a stage where everything has been developed and you notify the economist at the last minute to develop the analysis. Really embedding the economists in the group that is developing the regulation is an important part of our practice as well, that provides a better analysis, but also a better regulation. And I would love to hear from Camila and Sandra about your perspectives on this question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Sandra, both Sandra and Camila also have done a lot of work on this, specifically with those early on in developing these systems and taking consideration good regulatory practices. So perhaps maybe Camila, you can comment first, and then we can have Sandra comment as well.
I'll be quick. I think Kristen and Maria were spot on with their comments. And here I may just add that it's also about the correct mindset, right? To advance in the implementation of good regulatory practices, we must have a collaborative and open space, one that includes the dialogue. And I think here I'm severely biased because I'm from industry, but I'll say one that includes also the concern of listening to us that are going to be regulated formally via public consultation or informally. I think that here we have to understand that in the end, all of us are on the same side, because we want a regulation that poses the necessary levels of quality, safety, and efficacy or performance to the products that we are putting in the market, that protects the health of the public, and at the same time that is implementable, right? That leaves no gaps for interpretation. So it's good for the industry, for the regulators, and for the patients.
Thank you, Camila. Sandra?
Thank you, Besa. And I think complementing to what has already been said, I think that at the end of the day, the first element for us to continue building upon is it's like having these very many building blocks. And I think the very first one is knowledge, understanding. And I think that these type of events, these type of workshops are definitely very, very helpful for us to start with this very first block. Knowledge is really the key for whatever we want to achieve. And following on what Camila was mentioning, we're all here for the same purpose. That has to do with safety of patients. That has to do access to medical products pharmaceutical products, medical devices, IVDs to the public. And in that regard, just putting together some of the pieces of information that we have heard today: transparency, open communication, continuous communication, and co-responsibility. And you have heard me say this many, many times. And it's just also complementing what Camila said. We are all in the same boat, but it is not a matter of some of us rowing and some of others just resting. It is that all of us have to be rowing in the same direction. And for that, again, to happen, we have to be knowledgeable, but also we have to be knowledgeable and work under a system that GRPs, as the FDA has implemented. It didn't happen overnight. And you have developed a very strong system that is managed within the quality management system. And this is an area that not only regulators could be benefiting out of implementing, but also the regulated sector, because it is frequent that within the quality management system of the manufacturers, just to give an example, they're not necessarily including an SOP where the good regulatory processes is incorporated as to guide the involvement in the development of regulations. So again, I mean, it's like we are two sides of the same coin, and we need to make sure that all of us are as equipped as it is required as for us to produce effective proposals, effective comments, effective responses to comments, so we can also make the best possible use of the available resources. Thank you.
I'm just gonna, sorry, I have to add, I mean, so many good thoughts here. I would say, you know, sometimes it feels like, especially when you're in the implementing phase, overall, that like you're looking up a huge mountain. But I think doing it in baby steps, and essentially like what Sandra is saying about, I mean, there are a ton of resources and tools to look at. And to me, I view it as just pick one and start with one SOP. And to me, I would choose public consultation and doing it, you know, as kind of the first step early in a rulemaking process. But I mean, there's different, maybe it's the unified agenda, maybe, you know, maybe there's just different ways, you know, the approach. But I think it's also being consistent about it and not just doing it once, but learning from the first time. And maybe you'll have like version 5 of the SOP at least, you know, and I think that means that it's working, that you started with something and that you're building upon it. FDA, we are revising our manuals all the time and things like that, because we're learning from our own processes. And as technology and things develop, that there's better ways to do things. And so we're never stuck in one thing, but the general approach does remain the same, that we're trying our best to communicate early on and consistently.
Thank you very much, Kristen, really well said, and some encouraging words there for those that are just starting. I see one more question, and it says, how can we get the help of FDA to reinforce reliance for registration process in Latin America countries? I think as we saw, I mean, Kristen mentioned and showed some of the databases, but FDA really spends a lot of resources and time in making our decisions very transparent. And that's one way that we can help show where our decisions are housed, and for the use for reliance mechanisms. We do in the our Latin America office, we're constantly doing outreach, engaging bilaterally and multilaterally with a lot of the stakeholders. And one of the areas that we're engaging is just this, about explaining where how we're making decisions, and also how and where those decisions can be found to help with those reliance mechanisms. So for the person that asked that question, I do encourage you to come and maybe make the request specifically as to what your the assistance that you need, and see how our Latin America office can help with that. As you know, I think there's a lot of resources that FDA spends in developing of the international standards that are used for the decision making, and we're happy to get more in depth and about that topic as well. I think that there's no other questions. Does anybody have any other comments before I start closing this webinar?
The only thing I wanted to add to what you just mentioned, Vesa, is that I think that question actually highlights again why good regulatory practices is so important, because it's not just instilling trust and confidence in, you know, the industry and applicants and the patient populations, but also with our regulatory counterparts to understand our own decision-making process. So if they do choose to rely on FDA, that they have a full understanding of why we came up with the rule or our general approach. So I think it, you know, that really touches on how important GRPs is just from every facet in every group. So really appreciate the question too.
Quick comment on that.
Definitely.
And indeed, I like to say that sentence that with great powers come great responsibilities, right? All the agencies of reference are actually expected to have a high degree of implementation of the good regulatory practices and to support the advancement of good regulatory practices worldwide, as the FDA has been doing here for the region. So thank you. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And I see Sandra's hand also up.
Yes, thank you. And I know we, as Kristen, I think was very much into the point. I mean, we need to get started like step by step. Earlier this morning, during a training session that we are developing in Pretoria, South Africa, we learned from the head of the medical devices area the way she sees things, and she sees how they should be moving forward. And she was saying, if you want to eat an apple, you have to eat bite by bite. And I think that is exactly what we need to be doing here. And for us, one of the, I mean, there are many elements that are very critical, but probably one of the elements that are of extreme criticality for regulators, for most of the regulators in the globe, has to do with the regulatory impact assessment in regards of the available resources at the regulator. It is not only the impact to the industry, it is not the impact that it will have in the cost of devices or pharmaceutical products, it is the impact on the regulator themselves. What is the workload that is going to be added, or what is the workload that can be diminished because of the proper implementation of a whole process? And I think in that regard, probably that is an area that we could be also providing support to the regulators on what are the best possible ways to run regulatory impact assessment. And I think that will also be another kind of like the essential initial building blocks in this journey to become all masters, I could say, in good regulatory practices.
Thank you, Sandra. I think that made some probably for some really well closing remarks. I really don't have much else to say. I mean, I think we've heard just ultimately the combination of robust regulatory impact analysis and the transparent communication strengthens the effectiveness of the rulemaking process, fostering regulations that are evidence-based, responsive, and in the best interest of public health and regulated industry. So I think with that, we'll probably now close the webinar, unless Sandra, you as a co-organizer of this event would like any for last minute words. There's one thing that I also wanted to mention that I forgot. We're hoping that this is not the last webinar. We're hoping that we can continue these discussions regarding GRPs. This is as you mentioned, this is a big undertaking, and we would really like to share our experiences and our processes and how we implement GRP. So if you have any feedback about the webinar today, or if you have any suggestions about where we need to focus, perhaps in the next webinar or discussions. We are open and welcome those suggestions by all of you that participated. And with that, Sandra, I'm not sure if you had any last minute words as a co-organizer of the event.
Just a few, and this is really to thank the FDA support in all the efforts that organizations as FIPHARMA and the coalition are putting for us to move forward and to further advance in our journey towards regulatory convergence. So we are really very, very appreciative of all the support that we get from you, the support and the collaborative work that we do with FIPHARMA. And most of all, I mean, it is clear the interest that the need to gain knowledge in this area. We have had like over 180 attendees, virtual attendees. That speaks by itself. And that is only possible because people is really understanding the relevance of getting knowledgeable about these topics, but probably at the highest level of importance, that the information that is being shared in these webinars is really of value. And that is coming from really wonderful, strong experts that are willing to share the knowledge for us to continue advancing. So really, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. And I want to take an opportunity to thank all of you, but also Kristen and Maria for providing those presentations, because I know it took a lot of effort behind the scenes to bring this information to us and share it with all of you. So thank you very much. And with that, we can conclude the webinar. Thank you.